So welcome. This is the values-based collection development approaches to ebook acquisition panel that you're in. So we have up on the stage here our speakers. So just next to me here is Angela Carreño, Head of Collection Development at New York University Libraries. On the far end is Emily Farrell from the MIT Press, who has not had an ouzo for lunch, liquid coverage. Not, right? No, okay, good. And in the middle, Jill Morris, the Executive Director of PALCI. And I'm Charles Watkinson, I'm Director of University of Michigan Press and Associate University Librarian for Publishing at U of M Library and winner of the longest job title award. So it's good to have you here. So the plan for our presentation today is I'm going to make a few introductory remarks to explain how this came to be, this panel. Then we're going to have 5 topics for discussion. So we're going to have 5 questions, 5 topics showing on screen, and I'm going to ask the panelists to address those. Because of the size of the room, we're going to have a section for questions, answers, comments from the floor at the end with this microphone just here. And we'll get going. So first of all, though, as a warm-up, here's a question for you. What do all of these schools have in common? And this is a shout-out round, so feel free to shout out. Or not. Is it that there's a predominance of purple in their logos? Yes? No? No? I mean, geographical location? You know, North America, but it's kind of spread over the place. Okay, I think the point here is that you're looking at a list of very, very diverse schools, and so finding a pattern is really quite hard. You've got some very small schools. The H in the middle you may not recognize, that's Hines Community College in Mississippi. You've got some extremely large schools, Duke, Penn, NYU. And you've got some liberal arts colleges, you've got some public regionals. So it's a big spread. And what they all have in common is that they all purchased the University of Michigan Press ebook collection, which is great. But when we saw this, so the collection launched at the beginning of 2019, and as we saw orders coming in, we were starting to get very puzzled because we had got the projections, you know, expectation, lots of ARLs, it's a pretty specialist university press collection, and this was not making sense with our projections. And so we went out and we asked some of these schools, why on earth did you buy University of Michigan Press ebook collection? Not like that, because we asked them. And, you know, the first answers were, you know, the sort of things that any ebook vendor loves to hear, you know, value for money, fit with subject focuses, the comprehensiveness of the collection. This is one of those collections where you don't have to hunt and peck. You get the whole University of Michigan Press frontlist catalog of monographs every year. Some of the schools, when pushed a little bit harder, talked about some of the particular features they liked. So we were starting to get to a little bit more in terms of patterns. So a number of them were very interested in textbook affordability. So the fact that we were including all the adoptable monographs as well as the very specialist monographs, and that it was unlimited, multi-user, DRM-free, that was attractive to them. So that came out. The commitment to library friendly, and of course that's a very generic sort of term, but what we were looking to do was really meet and exceed the Charleston principles. So things like whole ebook ILL. So that was something that people were appreciating, scholarly sharing made very easy. These are things that Lyrasis as a partner was pushing us to do. And some of these schools were very interested in digital scholarship. So they were seeing their own scholars doing a lot of digital scholarship work. So they really liked the fact that we had our own platform underneath, which is all about embedding multimedia in narrative, and we were trying to push the boundaries there. So all that stuff was good. and we were excited by that. But then there was something else, and it was a pattern that we started to see, and it was really interesting and tantalizing. And that was a commitment to supporting values that aligned with their own institutions. So those values, some of the things that we were hearing were bibliodiversity. You know, the idea of a kind of ecosystem thinking, wanting to support smaller publishers as well as large publishers, wanting to contribute to the health of an ecosystem. Accessibility was coming up, but in an interesting way, which is accessibility beyond compliance. You know, check, 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 you know, all these parts, but actually a real commitment to making these works as accessible as possible, and also a commitment to digital preservation, something from the publisher that went beyond the letter of the license. That was also coming out. Another value that we heard several partners talking about was open source, and the fact that they appreciated that at the same time as supporting a collection of really interesting content, they were supporting the health and sustainability of an open source platform that was built on other community open source tools. So this was really interesting. So this values-based kind of conversation was happening, and this is the pattern that we were seeing hanging together with those institutions. And it was interesting, sometimes it was quite informal. It was one visionary AUL, associate dean, collections development officer, but sometimes it was much more institutionalized. There was actually a process with criteria that were being checked off by a group evaluating an electronic resource like this. So anyhow, I was at ACRL, and I was talking to Emily at the booth, and of course, at the same time as we launched University of Michigan Press ebook collection, MIT had launched MIT Press Direct, and we found that we were experiencing the same thing. We were seeing a different spread of schools than we'd necessarily expected buying, and that's where this idea for a session came from. So this is where we are coming from. Emily then, we talked, and Emily was the person who led and said, I know two awesome people who we can voluntold, we can voluntel, no, we can invite, sorry. And that's how Angela and Jill came on board. So, without further ado, we're going to explore this concept a bit more. And I'd like to ask the group here, what do we mean by a values-based ebook collection development approach? Anybody want to kick off?
So back in 2013, I was involved in a Charleston session titled University Presses and Academic Libraries Demystified. And during that session, I outlined the fact that we're in the same ecosystem, and that the scholarly monograph is bread and butter for the humanities, that we are trying to support research, teaching, and learning, and we have to work together on sustainability. And I can remember stating that I don't equate use with value. And I talked a little bit about the importance of niche in the humanities. NYU, for example, has an institute for the study of the ancient world, and it's a very small club that definitely does niche research that helps us understand what it is to be human. And there's always new. And I cannot predict nor always understand what's going on with new, but by golly, if we have to explore animals and their role in history and that's new, I want to be there because I'm excited that people are exploring new. And sometimes these books are definitional for the field. I hear about grad students pulling together a list of books that they need to absorb in order to feel they have grounding for a field, and the humanist scholar especially will often say, I need long-form scholarship to really explore the complexity of my topic. And so from the beginning, I have recognized the value of the monograph and have set an ebook strategy specifically to recognize that importance. And the first effort tied in with reconceiving of the book collection in support of 2 global campuses. So that just made us zero in on the transition from print to electronic and the importance of trying to serve up books remotely. So that was a big value. And then from there, it was research library and how do I collaborate and afford full coverage. You know, how do I team up to take care of preservation and completeness of coverage, to serve scholarship in New York with my partners, Columbia University Library and NYPL Research Libraries in my case. And more recently, the question has been, as a research library that's involved in a borrowing collective, when I transition from print to e, what is sharing? How do I share?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Morris. I'm the executive director at PALCI, and I'm very fortunate to work with Angela as part of my consortium. I'll just give a little bit of context for the work that we do in my group, because that shapes how I define values-based collections. So within the PALCI environment, we serve 70 academic and research libraries in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and West Virginia. And actually, Charles, when you put that slide up with all of the logos, I thought, well, that looks like my bunch. And many of them were up there, so yay, they bought your collection. But we are a very diverse bunch of libraries. And some of you may have been at one of the plenary sessions on the first day of the conference where Lorcan Dempsey showed the triangle of diversity in terms of institutional mission, with research sort of up at the top, liberal education, liberal arts, focused at institutions with missions that are very focused there, and then career-focused institutions over on the other side. And he showed PALCI up there. So for those of you who were there, you saw the spread of the institutions that I am challenged with serving and very privileged with serving. And this group of institutions, of which NYU is a part, are looking for ways to collaborate and trying to figure out how in this environment, how do they come to agreement despite their diversity, and probably really it's better to say, how do they leverage that diversity in a way that helps them achieve the things that they value? And so my values are very much their values, and Angela's described some really deep insight there, and I'm very fortunate to work with somebody who has thought so deeply about what it means to a research institution, what's their value, and what do they bring to the table. And then I have to take what she says and then think about all of those other institutions that are in the mix as well, and figure out, well, how can we serve the values that are happening across all of these diverse institutions? It didn't take us too long to figure out, I think, that diversity of institutions was a true value for us, and that led to diverse collections in a way, and especially in the print world, because part of what we do in the PALCI Consortium is resource sharing. So we ship physical books to each other. And the more diverse our ecosystem is within that environment, the better in terms of being able to serve patrons with just about anything they want to get their hands on. And then when you come to the e-world, we're trying to do the same thing, right? We're trying to figure out how do we make sure that that diversity is represented there as well as we build collections prospectively, and how do we figure out what collections focus we should take, because I've got research institutions who would much prefer to own the content that they would like to have access to versus my smaller institutions, which are comfortable with an access-based methodology. So Angela and I led a summit actually in the PALCI consortium back in very early 2018 at the University of Pennsylvania. Our Collections Advisory Council came together with actually a bunch of our resource sharing and technology folks to talk about actually what do we value and how are we going to work together. So this was the conversation we had, was actually what are our values that we can agree upon. And one of the very first things that really came to light was just that diversity of institutions and of institutional mission was really critical for us. And we built on a lot of what Angela put forward as NYU's ebook strategy, realizing that these differing values don't necessarily need to be at odds. And in fact, if we're looking for ways to create a sustainable ecosystem for our PALCI consortium and also for our publishing ecosystem and supporting the work that's happening there, we actually need that diversity. And it's one of our unique strengths, we believe, in terms of how we work together in our consortium. So we talked about a number of different things. We certainly valued ownership, and we recognized the need to engage both ends of our spectrum in terms of the access and ownership. We certainly talked about many of the things that Charles already mentioned in terms of focus on preservation, bibliodiversity, and the diversity of publishers that we're able to work with. We talk constantly about being an ecosystem and how does our role, how does what we do here impact folks over there. We've been very focused on our ability to share our collections. We negotiate into our agreements at every moment we can, full ebook ILL rights, which is still something that is in discussions. We're doing it as pilots. And Angela's comment that use does not equal value, I very much came into the conversation thinking, well, certainly I have to show the value here and how much things are being used. And this conversation has made it less simplistic, made the conversation more complex and really rich, I think, in terms of what we're able to do together. And I'm happy to share later a little bit about kind of some of the opportunities that our group has embarked on. But I'm going to let Emily share first. So.
Thanks so much. So this question, I think, is, a lot of this is driven from libraries in terms of, well, what is values-based collecting, but it's sort of unavoidable for university presses, I think, particularly, and certainly other scholarly presses and society publishers as well, but in the university press world particularly, the fact that we operate within a university. MIT Press reports to the library, similar to Michigan, and we are very closely enveloped, intertwined in the ways that the values of the institute itself are not only talked about but operationalized. So the university's mission in advancing research, teaching, and particularly for MIT, solutions to real-world problems. And part of that, of course, is the dissemination of research findings. And for ebooks in particular, for the humanities and social sciences, qualitative social sciences, particularly where monograph publishing is still very much centrally tied to reward systems, tenure and promotion, but also as a form in itself continues to endure as a consequence of the way that it is in fact research, that the writing of a book is the research process. But at the same time, when you're writing incredibly specialized research and in-depth research about dogs in the ancient world, for instance, you can't think of use in the same way. There has to be a different way of thinking about metrics. So that certainly ties very closely to the way that the press relates to the mission of the Institute and what we do. At the same time, when thinking about these values and this mission-driven process, it gives us perhaps a little bit of space to consider what it is to maybe step outside of market forces for a moment, or rather to be protected from market forces. Can we do that? And one of the ways, I think, or perhaps the only way we can manage to do that sustainably and with long-term thinking, is in deep and continued dialogue with our libraries and with the consortia that we work with. I think that's probably...
So I had so this is a sort of next question, but I was particularly interested by something you mentioned in passing, which is bibliodiversity. And the idea, that book publishing is a very long tail business, lots and lots of different publishers. And when we ask why are libraries adopting this strategy, could you talk particularly about that bibliodiversity, the ecosystem thinking, and why you care? Jill, I think you brought that topic up.
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned, in terms of how we share our print materials, we are always, I think one of the draws of even becoming a member in this consortium over sort of historical terms have been, look at the access I have to collections, these diverse collections that I would never have bought at my own institution. And that includes a range of publishers, a range of subject headings that maybe your institution doesn't focus on, but gee, I have access to all of that in a very short period of time and can get it easily through this collaboration with other libraries. And that strength in the print world is very different when you move to E. And when big institutions like an NYU are transitioning to electronic and they're not purchasing that print anymore, what happens in our space? How do we still serve those needs, knowing that we can't all buy everything? Even my research libraries tell me they can't buy everything. They're so reliant on those networks, even if it's for second copy, third copy. And so thinking about that transition to print and sort of the desire to create a sense of agency around how are we going to shape the world that we want to live in, and how are we going to fend off some of the forces that are at play in terms of budgets being cut and models that don't work for us anymore. So our group has been thinking about that quite a bit, and I think the concept of why we would go in this kind of a direction and why bibliodiversity is important to us, it's not any different than it used to be. I mean, we always want that diversity of materials available to us. And now it's just about, well, how do we in this new space make it happen? And we believe that's through collaboration of diverse networks.
So my beginning in libraries as a professional was as a foreign area subject specialist, a Latin Americanist, and I was very lucky to have that experience because collaboration is just part of what foreign area specialists do, and there's an appreciation for the importance of collections representing the research output from other regions of the world, and there's an acknowledgement that the copy level of these book-length studies that come out of foreign regions are super low nationally, 6 copies maybe, held in research libraries on average. So, so I've already have had to come to terms with an environment that puts access to the specialized monograph at risk, and the importance of paying attention, and was able to draw on that experience in thinking through the meaning of collaboration when the University Press scholarly monograph seemed at risk.
Yeah.
A quick comment in response. I think it's, as you say, the opportunity with working with foreign language materials in a way they're the canary, in that they're the earliest to go, and so seeing that the consequences of foreign language department enrolments decreasing and the effect on what that means for collections, you see it first. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the questions that we had here is, do you see these values-based collections development approaches spreading? Particularly, is this a luxury that libraries can't afford? I mean, is it really about, as budgets get cut, having to articulate use, cost per use, cost per use, cost per use? Or is there a conflict between values-based and value-based?
So way back when I said to myself, use does not equal value, what seemed equally important was to be creative about collaboration and to bump some of the work up to a network level. And the first conversations I had was, as I said, with my partners right in New York City. And initially it tied in with the economic crisis of 2008 and what looked like drawbacks on approval plans. And we had a number of brainstorming sessions and agreed to hold hands and try to think creatively. And what we reimagined was leveraging the ebook to ensure comprehensive coverage and preservation in a way that came pretty close to what we considered a sustainable budget pattern. And I mean, I can remember our first conversations with Oxford University Press for full coverage of UPSO, which would be the Oxford Scholarly Monographs, and their partner press, University Monographs, and talking about a world where the three institutions in New York could have an e-version and a print version that goes to an off-site storage facility. So we give primary consideration for the E. And if they could just accept us being transparent about what our spending pattern was and accept that commitment to spend, well, could we make it those 4 copies? And that conversation involved risk-taking, trust, data collecting, and a willingness to try something. So it meant that all 3 places had full coverage, and we didn't have to do anything scary budget-wise.
I definitely don't think that it's something that is only a luxury type of an approach. And many of my institutions, again, going back to the diversity that PALCI represents, really run the gamut in terms of their budgets, where they stand, and in terms of what they can commit to on an annual basis for their collections. And so many of my institutions I would not say are well resourced, and I'm sure they would say the same. And it's interesting, I don't think value for money necessarily conflicts with values-based. I think you can actually find ways to bridge the two. And I think that's what we've done pretty successfully in the PALCI consortium, where we've actually leveraged the values that we have in the research institutions and leveraged the values that our smaller institutions who are less well-funded place on their collections and bridged them. And so when I say that, one of the things that we attempted to do in our group was recognize that the larger institutions are going to buy these collections anyway. They're going to be making these commitments to publishers. Our smaller institutions are making commitments of their own, and not unlike the open access conversation in terms of who's paying what. We're also talking about that in our space as well. How can we leverage what's happening over here and recognize what the smaller institutions need too, and bring those together? So last year we did a consortium-wide purchase of a full backlist and a couple years of front list from Sage Knowledge, their ebooks. We bought their complete collection as a group. I don't know that if we had talked about it with them 5 years ago, they would have ever thought that was possible. And what we were able to do was have direct dialogue with our publishers, and we really value the ability to talk with them and come up with new strategies of helping to serve the values that our libraries do have and come up with a way forward. And so this is the approach that we're using in our consortium, and we've had good success with it. So we've been able to bridge those two.
Well, I'll be quick. I know the time is running out remarkably quickly.
I have a particular question for you coming up, Emily. Yes.
Excellent. Well, I won't talk too much right now. But to connect exactly with what you've just said, Jill, about dialogue, we are often asked, and I'm sure Michigan is as well, why on earth are you putting another platform into the ecosystem? Why do we have to deal with your platform now too? And it can't be overstated how valuable the direct connection and dialogue with libraries is to MIT Press particularly, and I know talking to colleagues at other smaller presses, how much that means to them as well. It's not just the conversations, the ability to answer directly the question, why are you doing this? But also just to bring back in a certain amount of control over what data we see, what usage patterns we see, albeit whether they are small. So that dialogue is incredibly important. It gives us a direct connection to the channel, the feedback channel. We can change things in response to what libraries need. We also knew, or I knew, having heard Angela talk for a while now on values-based collection approaches, that if NYU didn't come on board, we weren't doing it right. And we're very thankful to have NYU as such a great partner. And it was at least, NYU has indeed been a guiding light in this in terms of well-resourced libraries. But as with the pattern that Charles noted before, we've also seen that you can't take it for granted that that's where you'll get the support, and that we've also been very pleasantly surprised by the risks that small institutions are willing to make in coming on board with a platform that's in its first year of launch, and it's incredibly valuable to see that.
So, Emily, keep the microphone, because this is something that you and I have talked about a little bit. So do values ever come into conflict? And if so, how do you resolve this tension? So one of the things we've talked about a lot is collaboration, sharing across consortia, across groups. And I think as university presses, we look at that and we look at whole book ILL for ebooks, and we're like, I don't know. Is it going to be one library in the whole of the United States that buys one of our books and shares it with everybody else? So bibliodiversity, ebook sharing.
Yes.
How do we figure this out?
Yes, I know. When I heard you say that whole book ILL, we're not there yet, because there are a number of things that there are numerous tensions there. One of them, I think, is very common to all non-profits, which is we're generally staffed with a lot of believers. I mean, we believe in the mission that we are working towards. There is a desire to increase accessibility as much as possible. We want people using the content. We believe in the content we publish. At the same time, we do operate in a commercial market. We work in a market where we are competing with giant commercial entities that just are better resourced than we are. And we have to remember to look at the strengths that we have and to work from those. But when it comes down to it, we do need libraries to spend money with us. Or to come up with ways to find sustainable and viable financial models. And I think that that very frequently there's a lot of talk about new, particularly when we're in the digital space, where tech is still seen as the savior despite its difficulties, and yeah, there's still a long way to go there in working out how we find long-term. We focus on long-term thinking and we focus on sustainability in ways that work for both sides. It's something to work on.
And as Jill answers, if anybody would like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone as Jill speaks.
So I would agree with Emily that it is a challenge and that we have to talk through many of these things, because ultimately our goal is for the presses to be successful. So we're not looking for sharing to damage anybody, right? And so when we start having those conversations and coming up with ways of, well, what would work, and how do we share our materials in a responsible way that is respectful of the ecosystem that we live in, and also continues to allow our presses to produce the content they need. We're very aware of that on this side of the fence too. And I think when we start talking together, we come up with interesting solutions. And that's the place where we want to be in conversation. And I think values-based collections lets us do that.
So with this transition to the ebook, it seemed clear to me that we could no longer hang our hat on for sale, because whenever we let the book go, we still have unlimited copies of book, more often than not, and could fill the library with the books. So that's not ILL. But I also know that there are costs associated with the physical movement of the book. And on the journal side of things, we've worked with rules that we call Cantu rules that govern how we share articles. So I'm thinking, well, either there's a rule that can apply to the book, or there's an agreed upon carrot for the publisher that relates to the sharing of the book that would satisfy the ecosystem. And where's the infrastructure? Why aren't we there? The other thing that I think about often is print on demand. You know, if the e-sharing doesn't work, could print on demand work in some way? But I think that it's healthier for us to talk about solutions rather than hit a wall.
So, Doug, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Doug Way, University of Kentucky. It's interesting listening to this. It probably falls in the category you can't please all the people all the time. At Kentucky and previously at Wisconsin, I've actually resisted buying these collections really from a values-based approach, thinking this is bad for the marketplace. If I have every university press come up with their own platform and license separately, I'm actually taking away resources from other things there. And so it's been, frankly, a values-based decision not to acquire these collections, because I don't think it's good for me. I don't think it's good for libraries in the long term to have this, what I would call a disaggregation. As much as we don't like aggregators, they actually bring efficiencies and values there. And I think there's a real tension here listening to the benefits that you were talking about that you get from having your own platform versus the benefits libraries see from that efficiency there. So it's very interesting listening to this conversation.
Yeah.
Real tension, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different sort of tension. We use the aggregator as a subscription type commitment for a baseline collection, and have tended to license directly with publishers. And that got started with a research library mission in mind that had to connect with what is perpetual access. When I have that clause, please tell me what you're doing related to archiving. And I could never have that conversation with the aggregator. And the other is I get worried about permissions. Like when I need to revisit permissions for things like text mining or accessibility, it's easier for me to talk with the publisher than the aggregator. The DRM also came up quite a bit. I want a no DRM version of the book. That conversation is easier if I go direct with publisher.
And I know we're coming up to time. A last word to Jill, perhaps?
I would just add that we're experimenting with aggregation of content that we're purchasing directly from publishers for exactly that reason. We try to license dual platform and platform portability rights when we can, because we face that tension too, and we certainly want to make sure that access is there and that we have that diverse access that we're looking for. So, I don't know if you want to say
So
I'll just say very quickly that I think that there are more solutions to be found to that problem through consortia, particularly with the licensing piece.
And there's more to come, more to talk about, and there is a session coming up next where you can talk about more of this. Emily will be presenting, and Linnell from UMP, 3:30 in Cyprus Ballroom South. Here's where you go to purchase our wonderful collections, and thank you to our speakers, and thank you to you.